Hindsight is always 2020, as they say. And I was thinking the other day and having a little bit of a moan about this new generation of martial arts students and their lack of this and their lack of that. And then I thought back to my own upbringing in terms of the martial arts, and I thought, man, I was far from the perfect student. So that leads me to ask this question: what is the perfect student? Kia ora, I'm Tuari Dawson, and you're listening to the Invisible Sensei podcast. I think there's a number of different kinds of students, and perhaps as I speak about this, you will reflect on your own journey as an instructor, as a student, and hopefully as an eternal student. So, for me, I grew up at a time where, I was taught certain values, and I've already started turning into a grumpy old bastard. Not even 2 minutes into the podcast. But anyway, let's continue. Back in my day. But I was taught that, you respected your elders. And I really mean that. I come from a culture and I come from a family that were very much about that. We had a lot to do with our elders. And so, the idea of kind of inconveniencing them or causing any kind of what you call in Māori hara, or just trouble, just being a pain in the ass, was kind of the absolute opposite end of what you wanted to do. And so, consequently, there was always this really respectful attitude to people in positions of authority. And I suppose for me, when I started learning martial arts, and it became this thing that I felt like I really want to continue doing this. I don't know why, but I feel like finally I've found something. Maybe I didn't think of it at that age because I was 5 or 6 when I started. Maybe it was I just like wearing pajamas and doing flips on mats or something. But you get my point. And I think when you've done martial arts for a while, you have a couple of categories of students. For me, I have students that have come from other schools, other dojo, other styles, other approaches. I have students that have long histories, deep histories, and very much invested in the arts they did before they ever met me, and have gotten to senior rank. And senior rank, I guess I mean in terms of being Yudansha, being black belt or above. Then you have people who have kind of dabbled in a number of things over a period of time. They've done 6 months of that or 2 years of this, and they've kind of cobbled together their own, not style, but certainly an approach. And it's always interesting to me that whilst it's always interesting technically to watch these people train and to watch these people spar and practice technique and so on and so forth, there seems to be very little in the way of base. I don't mean that right across the board. I'm sure there's some incredibly gifted people out there that have done it that way, but they also seem to bring this whole kind of Jeet Kune Do kind of, what's the word, ethos. And for those of you who may not know, Jeet Kune Do was, of course, the martial art or the martial approach that Bruce Lee developed, and the catchphrase of which was, and I hope I get this right, keep what is useful, discard what is useless, and add that which is specifically your own, which I think is an excellent saying. But I think, for me, when you see these students, they're lacking a base, so it's very difficult to land on anything in particular and to build on anything in particular. And it takes time for them to, unlearn? Would unlearn be the right way of putting it? Yeah, perhaps to unlearn, or at least to park what they've done and to build fundamental technique. 3 is the student who's never done any martial arts but always wanted to, and they kind of start from scratch, working their way through the ranks slowly or quickly, depending on their skill and ability and their mentality. And then, step by step, session by session, training by training. Then there's kind of a subcategory in there, and that's students who work their asses off every single session, turn up to anything and everything that happens in the dojo to support, do extra training, but perhaps are not as technically proficient as the other categories. But given time, they can be. And perseverance and courage are very much two things that go together. If you want, I think, in my opinion, my humble opinion, if you want to get better at practicing. Perfection doesn't come easily, but I think, there's a few tricks of the trade. And one of the biggest tricks of the trade is to keep going, is to keep turning up and to keep practicing. And there's probably some categories that I'm missing out, but you get my where my head's at, man. The perfect student doesn't exist, but if they did, this is the kind of student that I'd want. Someone who practices the things that I teach them, goes home and practices them, has a common sense approach to it, in that you have students who are absolute fanatics, and then you have students who don't practice at all. They don't do anything of any lasting value in terms of doing anything in and of themselves. So they'll turn up, the only time they practice is when they're in a session. Now, if you're only training basically 2 hours a week, you're not going to progress very fast. But a student who practices, man, you can see it every session. You know those students that I'm talking about. They go home, they practice, and it may not be perfect. It's never going to be perfect. Let's be honest about that. But then again, we're not perfect either, and it feels like they're getting it. I think also too, I like students that are kind of invested in the welfare of the people around them, in the sense that I have seen some fantastic martial artists, some fantastic fighters that train hard, have beautiful technique, and these guys are going to be amazing, but have a complete disinterest in anyone else in the dojo. This can also extend to, I only turn up to the session if such and such teacher is teaching. And I think for me, another quality of the perfect student is whoever is in front, whoever's up the front teaching, whether they be a Q grade, whether they be a colour belt, whether they be a black belt, whether they've been training for 50 years or whether they've been training for a month longer than you have. It's the ability to look, react, and learn in a way that you're genuinely interested in learning from this person, and you have this mentality that I can learn something from everyone. Maybe the thing that you're learning is that this is not how to teach. That's a valuable lesson as well. But I think everyone has something to teach, and when you have those students who actually care about the people they're training with and training beside, that says a lot about their attitude. And I'm one of those instructors, perhaps, who naively, some might say, I really do believe in a dojo kon. And for the style of Goju-ryu that I do, Okinawan Goju-ryu that I do, our first dojo kon is be humble and polite. And humble in the sense that, you have a sense of pride in your abilities, but not overly so. You have a politeness, a deference, a investment in the people around you, that you have a communal aspect to your training within the dojo. I don't mean that it's a love-in and everyone sort of sits around and hold hands and sings kumbaya. I mean that everyone trains really hard. And for me, the perfect student is also about turning up early and showing support, not being an acolyte or a cult member. None of that stuff. I think there's something seriously wrong when I need a student to walk around behind me, bowing and scraping and saying "hey" after everything I say, or us, or whatever your dojo does. Um, Sensei, would you like one us or two usses in your tea? Us. Yeah, it gets kind of ridiculous, and I know for me, and there's nothing wrong with doing us if that's your dojo, but it's kind of becomes, it strays into some uncomfortable territory for me. Start becoming a guru, and the problem with being a guru is you might end up believing that bullshit, and then it gets really hairy, especially when you see some of these martial artists that have these incredible students, but these students can constantly debase themselves. For me, a perfect student is also someone who sees you as part of a pathway, not a destination in and of yourself. If I am encouraging students to be like me, then I'm probably not much of an instructor, to be totally honest, because I'm limited. And I'm working to try and improve those weaknesses and those flaws that we all have in terms of technique, in terms of personality. Those things are really, really important. I think that the kind of student that I'm after and that would be perfect is one that is not too overly self-critical and doesn't kind of fall prey to comparison, especially around, there's always competition in every dojo. But I would like to think that it is a healthy competition in the sense that you're kind of using each other to spur each other on. Using the example, the person next to you is training hard, so I'm going to train just as hard, and then I push it up a couple of notches, and then that person's, and we that saying, when high tide comes in, all boats are lifted. I like those kind of students. I've had students that have been looking for a guru, that have been looking for Mr. Miyagi, and added to that, I've had students especially younger students, whose parents bring them to me because they think a couple of hours of karate training a week will in some way, shape or form affect them to the point where it will change behaviours and perhaps heal emotional trauma. And I'm not saying that can't happen, but I'm saying that I think if you're looking for therapy, I think you should find a therapist and then use martial arts as part of that, perhaps. And it's always a lovely thing when people bring you their kids and say, oh, he's got an anger problem, or she's got a self-esteem problem, or whatever the issue is, and it's a real honour that people think you can do something about it. I think I deviated a little bit there, but you get my point. The perfect student is, for me, someone who can keep things in perspective, is not hunting grades, is not constantly looking at ways to create shortcuts in terms of technique, find a better way or a quicker way. You know what? Because there is no quicker way. I know there are some schools out there here in New Zealand that offer programs where you can get your black belt in 6 weeks, and which speaks to another problem in what is a black belt or a shodan or a yudansha. When you're getting it in 6 weeks, how based can it be? My point being is that when you hunt grades, for me, the grade will get a lot further away, because I think it's something a good student will get past. The idea of, when am I getting my next grading? When's my next belt? When's my next this? When's my next that? To enjoy where they're at and continue to embed that says a lot to me about the kind of martial artist that I think has a future. Also, for me, the perfect student, I keep saying perfect student, I'm thinking, Jesus, there's such a thing. There's probably not, but a student I would like to have is someone who has a balanced life outside of the dojo, that turns up on time, that will step in and sort of see a situation, and if they can help, they will. I also, the kind of student that doesn't feel the need to interject. There's a time and a place for questions, and they're not when you're being taught something. I know for me, and some people may disagree, and that's fine. When I'm teaching or where I'm being taught, I know that there is a time to listen and a time to talk. The time to listen is during the session. It's not a discourse. Unless I'm asked a specific question, unless there's an issue with safety or there's an injury, I really don't want to hear it. And for me, on the other end of that, I don't want to put that forward. I want to try and maximize any time that I have teaching and or training or learning or instructing. So I'm not into let's have a discourse about the merits of this particular stance. Let's just do the stance and we'll talk about it in the changing room when we're having a coffee afterwards or whatever. You get my point. I don't know if the perfect student exists. I've never met one. But I think I don't want a student who is looking for a father figure or an uncle figure. I mean, that happens kind of in and of itself, but, I think that that's also a place of danger. And I mean, when you put people on pedestals and invariably they fall off those pedestals, I have had that experience myself. So I guess I'm speaking for myself of putting the instructors that I had up on this ridiculous pedestal of perfection, and there's no perfect people. So yeah, I think also too when people put me on those pedestals, it really happens. But then it's a lot of pressure to carry the expectations of other people, and I'm trying to deal with my own expectations, which are hefty and are very heavy. I don't know if the perfect student exists. I suspect not. But I think something that I'm learning is that students can't, what's the word? It's very difficult for students to read our minds. Don't expect our students to be able to become what we hope they will if we don't tell them. Communication is really important. I know that in Japanese dojo, it's like, watch what I do and then just copy it. And there's no conversation traditionally, there's no conversation entered into. You may not know what you're doing, you just know, yep, I've got to copy what I'm doing, and later on, the meaning may or may not be taught to me or emerge. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that. I think it's very hard to be something you've never seen. It's very hard for our students coming in, bringing in their life experience and their, biases and expectations into the dojo. So in some way, I think it's important to meet them, to be able to say, look, this is what we do here. This is why we do it. And if it's not for you, you're most welcome to look for something else. And I don't think there's any shame in that. I think sometimes it's important to remember that, at least for me in my dojo and how I like to train, is that I'm trying to teach a craft. I'm trying to teach martial arts. Fighting, to be honest, people may dislike this. I mean, yeah, of course there's a competitive aspect, the fighting aspect, not competitive so much, but, a strong martial aspect. But for me, I'm at a place and at a time in my life where I want to encourage good young people that will become good older people and be good parents and teachers and policemen and nurses and doctors and politicians and whatever. That's what I'm interested in. People are not looking to become, I think, in the dojo, they're not looking necessarily to become Bruce Lee. Well, maybe some are. Yeah, I was in the beginning. My point being that when people come to the dojo, I think ultimately what they're looking for is a better understanding of themselves. And it's important that we give that to them, and it's important that we understand there are no perfect students, just like there are no perfect sensei.